Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your host, Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Susan Boynton, Professor of Music and Director of Medieval and Renaissance Studies at Columbia University in New York, who is with us to discuss the education and role of child oblates in medieval monasteries, how they learned, what they sang, and how they fit into the life of the monastery. We also touch on the education and role of children singing in cathedral choirs, and of course, a bit about the fun customs like that of boy bishop. If you'd like to learn more about the history of sacred music and dive deep into the big picture so that you can be better formed by the Church's music and prepared for thoughtful leadership in sacred music, I'd encourage you to look at the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music's summer course, History and Principles of Sacred Music. We cover the history of sacred music from its Jewish roots through the long Middle Ages into the Renaissance and more modern periods. We do in-depth study of papal and conciliar documents, and we tackle practical and pastoral issues that arise in sacred music programs. The emphasis is on spiritual development, formation through immersion into the Church's music, and thoughtful analysis of the Church's music and documents so as to discover the principles that emerge from history about how the Church thinks about her own sacred music. The course starts on May 30th and runs for 9 weeks at your own pace week by week, and then we meet together live online July 31st and August 1st. More information and the application are available at our website, catholicinstituteofsacredmusic.org. And now on to our interview. Thanks so much for joining me today, Susan.
Thank you for inviting me.
So there are many topics that you are really knowledgeable about that our audience would find very interesting. And today I'd like to focus a little bit on a child's life in a monastery, which seems a little strange to us modern listeners. So if we could talk about child oblation and also just the aspect of children's music education and those sorts of things that developed in that practice. So could you describe what circumstances would precipitate a family's decision to offer a son or a daughter as a child oblate in the Middle Ages to a monastery?
Oblation, which goes back to the very early Middle Ages, was theologically considered to be a family giving a child as a gift to God, dedicating the child to the service of God. And so oblation was often a decision made by an affluent family that one of the children, if not more of the children, would end up in a monastery at a pretty early age. It could have been as early as 3, even younger, or a bit older, although statutory ages for oblation in canon law were often later than that. And so there's a theological motivation. There was also a social motivation in that the placement of a child from a local family in a monastery, in effect, would be accompanied by a gift from the family to the monastery. And some have rationalized this as almost an insurance policy, that child becoming a permanent member of the community would in effect be a capable steward of the property that the family had given to the monastery. So there could even have been a socioeconomic aspect to this kind of giving.
Right.
But it was a very deeply inculcated social value to give one's children to the Church, both boys and girls, throughout the early and central Middle Ages. And there are cases that are known of families giving children who are perhaps not affluent, or there were reported cases, or there are allusions to cases where children are given because they were disabled and could not become knights, could not become warriors, or do other things that the families would want them to do. And I don't think we have the historical information to know how frequent that was, but it does seem to have existed as a reason. Another reason would be that if there are numerous children, that some of them would have to be married, some would go potentially into knightly service, if, again, speaking of affluent families, and it would just be an expectation that some would go into the Church. So a child might, in some cases, later on have a career not in a monastery, but as a bishop in a secular church, but would start out in a monastery as a monk.
Right. So you mentioned a little bit about the child eventually maybe having some financial stewardship role, but what would the family's connection to the child and the monastery really be following this act?
So the family would give the child literally as a possession, as a piece of property to the church, accompanied by property and with a formal deed of transfer. And so, in that regard, the family would actually relinquish effectively control over the child, or you might say ownership of the child from that moment. However, it appears that relationships between Oblates and their families might have been a little more complicated than we would think, based on that idea of the oblation. And also, there's evidence that the walls of the monastery might have been a little bit more porous than there are thought to be, based on the idea that monks are entirely cloistered and that nuns are entirely cloistered. So I would imagine that there would continue to be a political connection. The child could no longer go and leave the monastery to visit the family, but there could still be understandings of family ties and agendas that could be local, with regard to the region. And as I said before, property ownership in the region that would unite the thinking of the family and the child oblate as when the child oblate became an adult. But I don't think that there was not a sort of possibility of visiting or close physical interaction or going home. The child, once arrived in that monastery, really was supposed to remain in that monastery.
Right. So one of the things I'm sure that was also in the minds of families and the experience of children was that the children would receive an education. Could you speak a little bit about the initial experience of education for these children and, like what sorts of materials formed the basis for that education?
So children would be educated as members of the monastic community. And in terms of reading, the first things that they would learn would be the Psalms, the texts of the Psalms they would have to memorize. They would also learn prayers. They would learn, perhaps not from reading it themselves, but from listening to it, the texts of the Bible, whether these were read as readings in the refectory, in the Mass, in the office, in preaching, in the collation at the end of the day. So they would be exposed to sacred texts. In addition to the Psalms, they would learn the hymns of the divine office. And they would learn at a certain stage, when they were more prepared or for formal learning, they would learn Latin grammar. And so the monastery, in effect, was a school both for the common kinds of medieval Latin training and medieval education in the what we would call now the humanities, in basically the language arts. And it was also an educational center for learning life. That is to say, many of the values that young students would acquire and would learn in the monastery were inculcated through daily life, such as the concept of hierarchies. And of course, central to all of this was singing in the divine office.
Right.
So one of the most crucial aspects of the learning of child oblates was learning to sing, whether in a choir of oblates or whether blended into the adult choir. And they would be taught by members of the monastic community. They wouldn't be taught until later in the Middle Ages. They wouldn't be taught in a separate school. They would be taught within the community by other monks. And their training would be a combination of learning to read and learning to sing. So the Psalms, for instance, would be memorized, and they would presumably be memorized in part through singing the Psalms, but they would also be memorized as texts.
Would you describe, do you think that the general trajectory of the education then was initially first the experience and oral learning, and then translating that into a textual education?
Well, this is an excellent question, because it might depend a little bit on the age group as well. Much younger children would not be expected to be literate. So when they started learning, they would have to learn by ear. So music was typically taught by ear, with basically students or children singing after they hear somebody else singing the same thing. So simply rote learning by ear. Now, slightly older children could be expected to be literate or could learn to read. And then a book would be an important support for the learning process. And so there's some textual evidence referring to this. When others were educated who were older, so these would be novices, adult novices, and they could be of various ages, they were more often expected to be able to read. And so a lot more of their learning could take place through reading as opposed to through rote repetition or through oral transmission. So I would say that there was a combination of different approaches.
Right. So one of the examples that you cite in your work is that of Notegar Bulbulus. Perhaps maybe some of our listeners are familiar with his story, but for those who aren't, could you just kind of recap his own account of the origins of the genre of the sequence and, perhaps a bit about what that experience of his offers as an insight into the education that boys like him would have received?
So Notegar, around the year 900, describes being in a monastery and having trouble as a young boy memorizing the long melismas. He specifically mentions these melodii that are very long.
Right. And here, of course, you're referring to the melismas in the Alleluia of the Mass.
And he began to think, how could he memorize them more effectively? And then a monk came from Western France, fleeing the Vikings, and had written poetry which was set to the melodies of these very long melismas. So it was Latin poetry that was essentially creating a syllabic setting, which resembles what we now think of as the sequence. It also was like a prosula, which is another genre of syllabic music from this time. So Notegar sort of critiqued these settings that this other monk brought from Jumièges, and then Notegar began to write his own. He began to fit Latin words to the notes of the very long melodies. Then he showed them to a teacher who then told him they should all be syllabic. They should be one note per syllable. And he revised his poetry, his settings, and then he showed them to another teacher. And that other teacher was delighted and gave them to other students to sing. So this reflects a couple of interesting things. One of them is the idea that writing and the creation of poetry and texting music could help memory. It also shows the Latin pedagogy that Notegar was receiving. He had teachers to whom he showed his poetry, and the teachers then approved that poetry and then gave it to other students who were learning to sing. So it describes a community of singers. And we know that at St. Gall in this period, they did compose various poems, sung poems for students, for the young boys in the monastery to sing on certain occasions. So it gives a sense of kind of the various aspects of learning and performance and how they're related to each other.
Yeah, and it's such an interesting example. The next thing I'd like to ask you about is someone that everyone always thinks about in terms of the development of pedagogical techniques, but this idea of texting the melodii is an interesting insight. So could we talk a little bit about the more famous pedagogue here, and that is Guido Oretzo? Could you describe perhaps a bit of some of the methods developed by Guido, perhaps out of necessity? And
right. So,
yeah, and maybe what ages was he aiming these methods at?
So Guido would have taught in a monastic community. So he would have been teaching boys. Now that could go up to 15 or 16. So he could have been teaching boys as young as 4, and they could have been as old as 15 or 16. I'm just estimating those ages. Of course, we don't have that information precisely. But he does describe that the training of a singer would take 10 years. And he's referring to the fact that the chant repertory was terribly difficult to memorize. And yet, because of oral transmission and because in the first half of the 11th century, staff notation was not really in use, it meant that people simply had to memorize. The oral tradition was a necessity for the melodies. And so Guido describes a couple of systems to facilitate the quicker learning and more efficient teaching of chant. One of them, he developed a new system of notation. So he may not have invented staff notation altogether. There are various early experiments with using letter notation and maybe a line, an orienting line. But Guido does describe something innovative that then became used and adopted and widely diffused in Italy and Western Europe, which is the use of colors for lines. So in one of his treatises, he describes in great detail the idea that the notes should be aligned, basically vertical spacing, such that one would always know that a note in the same position vertically in relation to others would be the same note. He also described the idea of using lines and spaces. And he describes using a yellow color for the line corresponding to the pitch C and a red color for the line corresponding to the pitch F. So that innovation of using specifically colored lines does seem to have been his own idea and became widespread. So using something which is a visual prompt and is very specific and has a one-to-one correspondence between the vertical position in relation to other pitches and the identity of the pitch means, of course, it would facilitate the ability to read from the page, and it would facilitate the ability to learn more quickly. The other thing that he proposed is the use of the psalmization syllables. So based on the melody of the hymn Ut Queant Laxis for John the Baptist, he proposed that the syllables of that hymn, the beginning of the hymn, melody could be correlated with other melodies so that people would carefully look at the contour of the hymn melody, of the hymn's opening notes, and associate it in an associative manner, compare it to the other melody, a portion of another melody that a singer is trying to learn. And that intervallically, one would then find, if one found a match, one could then study and apply further the same idea of intervallic relations. So his innovation in this regard is the concept of trying to understand intervallic relations between pitches as a guide for learning new melodies, to take a fixed melody and to use that as a reference point for learning a new melody. And the whole idea of interrelationships among pitches being a guide and a key to being able to learn new melodies is absolutely central to his method.
It seems that a frequent question that comes up is whether that hymn existed before Guido used it, or that did he have a role in kind of modifying it or in any way to fit this pedagogical purpose?
Well, the hymn did exist and melodies did exist. It might be that the melody he used is one that he composed because the transmission of the hymn melodies before this time is very sparse. That is, the texts were written and transmitted going back to the Carolingian period, but the actual melodies were not widely written down. So there is the possibility that he devised that melody. But it also could be that he didn't, because as I said, there could have been an oral tradition of various melodies that we don't have access to in a written form from that period. So he didn't necessarily propagate the use of the syllables themselves, but rather of this idea of associative use of intervallic content.
You know, this use of the mutation of a hexachord with the solmization syllables, that you have 6 syllables and you can put them in different positions and generate the entire gamut. Was this something that he came up, or did he develop that from someone else's idea?
I am not sure that he completely invented it. I think it was related to other treatises that he refers to obliquely. I mean, the gamut existed before, and so his reading of the gamut is basically one step in a long history of the study of pitch content in relation to the gamut as a structure.
Was the use of his hand to show this gamut one of his inventions as well, or something else he took from someone else?
That is considered something that dates after Guido, the use of the hand.
So it's not really a Guidonian hand.
I mean, it's a Guidonian hand based on his use of the syllables.
Oh, interesting.
But proposal of the syllables.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's in the manuscripts of Guido's treatises.
Yeah. Interesting. One of the other sources that you use a lot for your research in this area is a customary. Could you describe what a customary is and what sorts of insights it offers into these processes of education?
So the customary is a prescriptive document, and it's a text that describes the different aspects of life in a monastery. and some are more extensive than others. It's prescriptive because it tries to describe what should be done, and it may not always be a snapshot of reality, so it shouldn't be taken as descriptive. The customary discusses who the officers are in the monastery, what their responsibilities are, what they do, and also the way in which the liturgy is performed. It can go into a great deal of detail in the liturgy, but it also talks about the other parts of the entire monastic day, from the time people wake up until the time they go to bed, and what they do at different points in the day. It even can have things like recipes for what they would cook. For instance, one of them has a very long description of how to cook beans. You have everything in the customaries. You have the kitchen. Now, the liturgy is at the center of the time. The liturgy is at the center of the day's schedule, because the liturgy is a fixed set of observances of the hours and of the Mass, and that means that other things are planned around the liturgy. So descriptions of other activities always make reference to the liturgy, because people have to either be excused from the liturgy to go to that activity, or they have to leave the liturgy early, or they have to leave that activity in order to go to the divine office, and so on. So it's interwoven in pretty much every single thing, because even the duties of the officers in the monastery are also related to the liturgy in the ways that they have to either supply things for the liturgy, take the liturgy into account, or themselves be sure to attend the Mass in the office.
Right. So what might one see if we're looking at a customary about where these education processes we're talking about would happen?
So they would happen sometimes in the chapter house, and sometimes in the cloister. They don't always specify exactly where. Sometimes I'm sure they were in the church because they were rehearsing. And so at different times of day, the teachers responsible for training the choir and also for teaching the children would be rehearsing with them, typically rehearsing the material for the next day. Teaching, in terms of the idea of say, teaching grammar, we don't necessarily know where that would happen, but we do know that the singing would be practiced often in a space like the chapter house, and the actual rehearsal for the service, which could take place in church, was in itself a kind of a teaching environment or a teaching situation.
Right. So what were the titles of the monks who were actually in charge of the education of the boys in monasteries or girls in convents?
One of them was the armarius, or the librarian, who in the Central Middle Ages was responsible not only for correcting the books and for maintaining the library, but also for ensuring the education of the Oblates, and basically the job of this, and overseeing the liturgy as a whole, kind of a master of ceremonies. And the job of this person was very extensive as the use of books increased. So he would have an assistant, and there could be a succenter, who's the kind of an assistant to the cantor. The armarius would at times get conflated with the cantor. So the cantor was also the overseer of the liturgy as a whole. The armarius was more of a librarian and an archivist. The two could be one person, or they could be two different people, depending on the place. And they had to have, for teaching young children, they had to have an assistant. So the assistant could be called, there's actually the Latin word preceptor, which is like today's preceptor, or a succenter, or the assistant to the armarius. And then there were also individual magistri, the teacher, masters, who would work more closely in smaller groups, sometimes one magister with one or two boys that they would be teaching more individually. And adolescent boys would have a specific kind of tutor who would accompany them around. And so there were basically ways in which study went on a very individual or small tutorial basis, and then there were other ways in which study took place in a group.
Right. And so once they received this education, especially in the singing of the liturgies, how did their incorporation into those liturgies grow? You know, what did they start from singing this to obviously being able to sing the entire liturgy? But how were they incorporated with the adults?
That's a very good question, because I think some of that remains unknown. We wouldn't necessarily have precise information on something like that from the 11th century. But the sense that I get from the prescriptive text, which is the customaries, is that the child oblates were expected to sing with the choir in the choral pieces. So in the psalms, for instance, the psalms and the hymns, which were sung chorally, and singing the psalms, they could, if they were of an age to read, they could at a certain point consult a psalter if they had not yet memorized the psalms, which would suggest that they were singing the psalms at an early stage before they had fully memorized the psalms. And then there could be boy soloists singing on different occasions, particularly intonations of brief responsories or of great responsories, and certain processional hymns. So there are a number of different references to boy doing the intonation, or to boys. Sometimes there are references to boys singing separately in their own group. And that's not clear to me always if it means they stood together, so they're not really singing separately, but they're standing separately, or if it means they're actually singing separately. They would certainly sing quite a few of the pieces that are simpler, such as the brief responsory, and then they would sing along with the rest of the choir things like the psalm antiphons. And I assume they would sing things like the Magnificat antiphon, the canticles at the divine office, but those things are not always specified.
We've been talking mostly about monastic practices, but these monastic practices had an effect on the life of the cathedrals. Could you describe that a bit?
Yes. In the early period when there were singers in cathedral choirs, that is to say, singers who had actual prebends and, were paid singers with positions. This really starts in the 12th century that they start to have endowed positions for choir boys. They already are starting to live with the choir master, with their teacher essentially, in some part of the cathedral close. And this is documented really from the 12th century on throughout the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, the ways in which collegiate churches and cathedrals would make allowances and actually build their physical plant to accommodate a group of child singers, boy singers, or adolescent singers living in a house with a teacher and with their own separate choir master. So they participated as resident singers, and they would sing a number of services. I think the difference between monastic and cathedral singers is that these were paid positions, and so they received honoraria. They also, for special services, could be paid separately. They sang quite a bit of the same repertoire, and one thing they wouldn't have sung early on would have been the office hymns, because these were not sung in cathedrals. But they would be singing in the divine office. Now, the way in which the divine office is structured in a cathedral or a collegiate church is somewhat different from a monastery. So, of course, that would account for certain kind of differences in their performance. But they had special roles as well. They could be soloists, and they could take part in special celebrations, such as the boy bishop, or the special liturgy for the Feast of the Holy Innocents, for the feast of the circumcision, and certain chants on Palm Sunday were associated particularly with the voices of boys.
Right. Were there
and girls, not just boys.
Right. Were there substantive differences, do you think, in the methods for education? You mentioned the boys and girls actually living with their teachers, but what about the methods? Do you think that it was a lot different?
I think they're probably very similar, because the basic learning pattern is there's oral tradition, again, assisted by writing, depending on the period of time and depending on the age of the singer. And they were learning to read, they were learning Latin grammar, they were learning the Psalms, because even in cathedral environments or in a collegiate church, they still really did have to memorize the Psalms. This was the basis of really all literacy. And they were learning things that we didn't mention yet, but which Guido describes, for instance, the modes. They would learn how to classify the chants according to the modes. Part of the reason the modes were crucial, in fact, one of the main reasons the modes were crucial, was that knowing what mode an antiphon is dictated in what mode one would sing the psalm. So to sing antiphonal psalmody, it really was necessary to understand the nature of the modes and to identify what mode an antiphon was in, and to distinguish the different modes from each other, because all of whether it was the Psalms or the Magnificat or the Benedictus or just even the invitatory hymn, a psalm, they all had tones that differed according to the mode.
Right.
And I think another aspect that they would use both in early cathedral choirs and in monasteries was the monochord. So using this stringed instrument to demonstrate intervals and to demonstrate notes rather than always only singing was a pretty common teaching method.
We are more familiar in the modern day, obviously, with cathedral choirs of men and boys, or girls and men and boys, whatever. So it seems like at some point, the cathedral education of these singers kind of overtook the monastic practice. When did that practice of child oblation die down? And then also, it just becomes more, of course, we know of monastic schools which still educate, but really tends towards the cathedrals. Can you give us a timeline for that sort of trajectory?
Oblation reached its peak in the 12th century. And in the 13th century, there still is the practice of oblation, but canon law begins to dictate that there shouldn't be boys younger than 14. So you have fewer and fewer child oblates in general, and also a lot more adult novices coming into the monastic life. So I would say the 13th century is probably the turning point. And then in the 14th century, if we think of the example of England, they start to have almonry schools. So there are cathedral priories, which are effectively in England, then these are monastic cathedrals, where they have boys who are being educated, but who were not required to enter the monastic life. So they might even be tonsured, and they might live there in the almonry school. But their education, while a monastic one, was preparing them for life outside the monastery.
Right.
And some of these boys then would be trained to sing quite well. Some of them became the antecedents of really the singing schools of the much later Middle Ages and early modern period. You also had other monasteries that would have students. And so monasteries of women, for instance, also in England is the example I'm thinking of, would have a distinction between the sisters and then the students, who were then not destined to stay forever in the monastery necessarily. So Barking Abbey, for instance, had this. And so that you would have novices, but you would also have some who were perhaps not exactly boarding students, but they were not necessarily destined for the monastic life.
Right. Can we focus a little bit more on this cathedral practice? And in your work, you use for these sources an ordinal. So you described for us what a customary shows us about monastic education, but could you describe a little bit about what an ordinal is and how we can learn from that about these processes of educations, or even processes of education, or even practices that people know about today, like boy bishops?
So the ordinal is another one of these prescriptive documents that focuses on the liturgy more than a customary. Customary from a monastery would offer more about the life in the monastery. And an ordinal really summarizes or synthesizes the way in which the liturgy unfolds in the course of a day, in the course of a year. It typically provides a lot of incipits for the specific chants that are sung and readings. And the ordinals that we have typically survive starting in the 12th century. An ordinal will describe then the ways in which boys sing in and participate otherwise in the liturgy as acolytes, for instance, in the liturgy in the course of the year. So the ordinals refer to some special ceremonies, such as the boy bishop. And the boy bishop is kind of a ceremony, a ritual, a festivity when the acolytes or boy singers take over. And this occurs also in monasteries, but we'll talk about it in cathedrals, when they take over for one day the role of the actual bishop. And so they don't literally take over every aspect of it, but the concept is that they are imitating the actions of the bishop. And so one boy is chosen, and is chosen from among the choir boys or from among the acolytes, celebrates mass like the bishop. They go around. There's a kind of a ritual clowning aspect where they go around and are received in different houses of the canons, for instance, and are welcomed with wine. They're given special snacks. So there's a kind of a carnivalesque, kind of Christmassy, kind of a combination of carnival and Christmas, in that they're given gifts and they get to make certain choices about the liturgy and what to sing. And then on these days, typically there were extra pieces, or often extra sequences, other kinds of poems that were added in that were not typical of the regular liturgy and that reflected the festive and humorous, almost, or parodic nature of the occasion.
Yeah, one can definitely see why this would have been a popular sort of practice. Yeah. So a little bit more to something you referred to earlier, particular points when children's voices were typically heard. And you mentioned Palm Sunday, but also the Feast of the Holy Innocents. Could you talk a little bit about that repertoire right there?
So the Holy Innocents is a feast in which some of the texts are taken from the Book of Revelations, and so the 144,000 in the Book of Revelations are then conflated with the innocents in the Gospel of Matthew. That is, the children who are killed in place of Jesus. And so basically the procession, sorry, not the procession, but the festivity of the Holy Innocents includes singing of that repertory. And one of the special occasions, or one of the special representations that occurs on that feast, the 28th of December in the Middle Ages, seems to have been a representational ritual, what we could call a liturgical drama. And there are several examples of this. There are several different manuscripts that contain them, and some of them more elaborate than others. But in these, essentially, boys, choir boys, or acolytes, impersonate the innocents, and there's an acting out of the massacre. Then there is an acting out of the lament of Rachel over the dead innocents. This would be sung by a male singer, ecclesiastical singer. And throughout, the text is based in large part on scripture. So it's based in part on the Book of Revelations and that connection between the innocents and the 144,000.
Right. Could you describe a little bit about Palm Sunday?
So on Palm Sunday, there is a processional hymn, Gloria Laus, which is a Carolingian attributed to Theodulf of Orleans. And it has a refrain that refers to beauty, to sort of childish beauty singing. And so there was a tradition that goes back certainly to the 11th century, possibly earlier, of the children singing either the verses or the refrain, I think typically the refrain, in alternation with adults. And this could be sung in various positions or locations. It could be sung on a city gate or on the enclosure of the monastic precinct. It could be sung outside a church, inside a church. And so there was a kind of a staging of that alternation between the younger voices and the adult voices for the performance of that entire processional hymn. There's also, for the blessing of the palms, two antiphons that both begin Puri Hebriorum, the children of the Hebrews, and one describes the placing of the garments under the feet of the donkey bringing Christ into Jerusalem, and then that they spread out their garments in the road. And then the other one describes how they came to greet him with palm branches. So those two antiphons, which explicitly refer to boys, were on occasion actually assigned to boys for performance during the blessing of the palms on Palm Sunday.
Right. So a wrap-up question here. Do you think there are any takeaways from this process of education that modern educators can learn from?
Yeah, I think one thing is that young boys and girls, I didn't mention girls enough today, but a lot of what I said, except for the cathedral choirs, applies to girls, are very capable singers and can learn. And in many non-Western traditions, children who are 4 or 5 or 6 are learning really quite demanding music by ear and expected to perform at a very high level. So I think one takeaway is that children have extremely good memories, and that they are quick learners and have a lot of facility. And so one can entrust them with complex music. There are cases of this that exist in choirs today, here and there, but one perhaps shouldn't hesitate to assume that most children who sing could do this. Another thing is that one could start fairly young with training the memory of children to learn the Psalms, and expect children to sing along with their elders in choirs and participate fully. And another thing to take into account is that the oral tradition, which enabled so much music to continue to survive and into our own day, was very powerful in medieval Europe. And there are many traditions that benefit from this oral tradition and from training the young. So we really want to remember that to keep any kind of liturgical tradition strong, it's very important to educate young people in that tradition so that they can carry it on.
Yeah, those are great takeaways. And this has been so fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing your wealth of knowledge on this topic with us.
Well, thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is from the Prelude and Fugue in G Major, BWV 550 by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.